So welcome to part 6 in this series on drum kit ergonomics and setup. Today we're going to talk about cymbals. If you haven't watched parts 1 through 5, you may not understand why I think the drums are where they are, so go ahead and do that if you haven't. But if you just need the cymbal update, here we are. So you can have tons and tons of cymbals in a drum kit, and most drummers do. And not all of them can be 100% ergonomically placed. I get that. But of course, we are going to start with the most important cymbals, which I think everyone will universally agree are the hi-hat and the ride. So I have a 3-part series on hi-hats already, and one of the parts, I think it's part 3, is on the height of the hi-hat as compared to the snare drum. So I'll put a link to that somewhere if you want to watch it. But basically, we already decided where the hi-hat pedal should go, and that pretty much dictates the placement you see here on the left, because the hi-hat has to go straight up from the pedal unless you buy a really expensive remote stand. So for this video, we're just going to assume that you have a regular hi-hat stand like 99% of people. So of course, once the hi-hat is placed, the next cymbal will be the ride. If you're right-handed and you don't play open-handed for any reason, which we'll talk about in a little bit, then your ride cymbal is going to go on the right side of your kit. Of course, the most ergonomic way to do this is to have it so that you can reach it without lifting your elbow. So low is good, and close enough to your snare to where you don't have to reach is good. Basically, you should just be able to rotate your elbow around and get to the ride from where your hand was on the hi-hat. In a theoretical world, this would be great. So of course, if you have toms, it might change this a little bit, but the ideal here in the diagram is to have a sort of mirror image. Hi-hat is on the left and ride as close as you can get to the snare drum on the right, which is going to end up being on top of the bass drum essentially, because that's your right side. So it has been pointed out to me, and I don't disagree, that playing a crossed over right hand is not ergonomic. It's hard to reach over there, and it closes up your shoulders, and it's kind of strange. That's what most drummers do, and that's what you're going to find out when you're gigging or having to play on backline gear. If you're left-handed, I implore you, do in fact learn to play right-footed bass drum. That does not mean you have to play on a right-handed ride cymbal. You can play lefty on the hi-hat, and if you just put your ride cymbal on the left side, you can in fact usually move a ride cymbal over and no one will get too mad. Then you could play on a right-handed kit and ride with your left hand. A and B here would be both great places to put a ride cymbal on the left side so that you could ride with your left hand. If you're right-handed and really committed to ergonomics, you could begin learning to ride with your left hand and put all of your essentially leading cymbals, the hi-hat and the ride, on the left side. And then you would never cross over in either direction. Although if you already play right-handed, you might as well leave the ride on the right side. So essentially, when you're playing drum kit, the length of your arms sort of dictates the amount of space you have to put anything. So once you start having toms and cymbals, sometimes you have to make compromises. If you have a 4-piece, like pictured here, you actually don't really have to make any compromises. You can put the ride in the same place that it used to be because there's plenty of room in the middle for that single tom. And then the floor tom goes on the other side of the ride, and pretty much everyone's happy with this. So from an ergonomic perspective, this would be great. So once you get 2 rack toms, you're going to have to move something somewhere a little bit to accommodate them. And this isn't the end of the world. Because your hips are a ball joint, you can just move that pedal a little bit over on the arc and your hi-hat will make some room. Or you could move your ride a little bit to the right because your shoulder is also a ball joint. As long as it doesn't go up too high or around too far for your ball joint of your shoulder to reach it, it's not going to be a problem to sort of widen those out a little bit and fit a second rack tom in there. So once you have 3 or more rack toms, it starts to become slightly more problematic. You can rotate your shoulder out, of course, to a certain extent, and you can rotate your hips out to a certain extent, but then at some point you're just stuck. I mean, usually if you have smaller rack toms, you should be able to fit 3 in without a problem. If you have giant toms or you want to get 4 rack toms or 5 rack toms, then you have to make a prioritization decision. Am I going to play my cymbals more, or am I going to play those rack toms more? And you should put the cymbals or the toms, whichever you think you're going to hit more often, in the prioritized, more ergonomic position. So Neil Peart of Rush decided that his cymbals were more important than his rack toms, so you can see he always puts at least 1, if not 2 rack toms above his hi-hat, which is totally unergonomic from a tom playing perspective, but he doesn't hit them that often, so the cymbal is more important. So when we add extra cymbals to the kit, they're usually going to be crashes next. Effect cymbals you can place sort of wherever because you're not going to hit them that often. You'll hit crashes a lot. So if you're placing crashes ergonomically, I suggest placing them either in A, B, or C, and sort of in that order. If you have 1 crash, I would place it in A. That's pretty much the standard spot to have a crash. A second crash I would add as B because it's still in front of you. You don't have to twist. You could get it with either hand, and it's convenient to the ride cymbal. If you're going to add another crash, then maybe go with position C, because if you come off a tom fill, that's a great place to hit a crash at the end of a fill. Now, of course, how high you put your cymbals is sort of dependent on how high you put your toms and whether you need room for miking. But if you're reaching above head level, that is not ergonomic. So if your cymbals are below your head level, that causes you to be able to reach them with a stick without your shoulder actually lifting up. Because, of course, your upper arm will go down, then your elbow will bend back up, and your hand will be basically back at shoulder level without your shoulder ever having to move upward. So if you keep your cymbals where your shoulder can be below a horizontal level, then it's going to be much better on your shoulder joint. And so head level or below is easy to remember. So this picture is actually taken from a video on how to set up your drums on YouTube, and ironically, it's terribly wrong. So if we just ignore the drums and look at the cymbals, you can see that they've placed the cymbals as if the bass drum is facing forward, symmetrically, one to the right of the bass, one to the left of the bass. But really, we know that the drummer is facing the snare drum, so really it's one cymbal in front and one cymbal awkwardly far to the right for no good reason.